And one of the things would be to get people to come together in a forum. We create platforms for engagement for both government and your target group, but also importantly for organizations to create an enabling platform where people can actually do something about it. You don't just leave it there. So it's awareness raising, knowing what policy says. The second level would be to create platforms for engagement, and the second one is capacity building. We came back to and I think this is what Mo was talking about, that organizations who seems to have the facts about certain issues they try to change seem to do better than those who just sort of like react to a situation, right? And we also, what also came up was that networks are sometimes a very powerful way of communicating, but it's also a disenabling tool if you have networks with different visions. So you have to get people to speak with one voice. And that is where your sort of like more direct engagement with government comes in. We also had hostile governments and environments that exist, and the difficulty that people have in terms of shifting. And these are just some of the things that, your whole political or economic spheres, if those are sort of like in competition, then you struggle. And people said, well, things like irrational policy changes being made overnight, and then you don't comply, and suddenly you find yourself in a project that's no longer legitimate. Hijacking of programs by government officials, and of course intimidation, which is a big thing. But we came back to the question, well, if people are angry enough in a country or in an organization, they could still. But it seems like that was rebutted by saying it's easier than for people from the outside to effect change. And I think Mo's example was being used to say, well, he's not living in Sudan right now. So, he's living in the UK. So
interesting.
Yeah. So that was, and I think that is where I stopped. So Afsan, I don't know this piece, so you can move.
Some of the examples that we drew out of some of their experiences, one was mobilizing different stakeholders in consolidation of initiatives. That has been a useful technique in governance and accountability. Investing in community empowerment. I think John was saying that anytime that you have 1 million people behind you and you're trying to advocate for something, it's a lot easier to be shut down if they know that the powers that be are going to lose the 1 million potential voters. So people have to listen to you. So make sure you get a significant number of followers behind you. We spoke a lot about our sisters in Zimbabwe. And I was saying that, every time we come to these forums, some of us keep thinking that next year when we see the two of you, it's not going to be the same anymore. Something's going to shift. But we keep seeing you year after year. So we look forward to the year that we see you and things have finally shifted. But we spoke a lot about, that in Zim, a lot of the work that's done that might be called governance is not called governance because you get thrown into jail. And so people actually rather focus on service delivery or providing a particular set of services that's not being delivered because that's the only option. Anyone else wanted to add?
I think we also mentioned that negotiating for, accountability would be effective from a position of strength, e.g. when movements are mobilized, that will be able to influence, positive change. I think the other one was, I don't know whether you agree with me, the idea of taking government to court. And Afsan gave two very good examples on that. Whereas in a situation where the legal system works, I think it's
where the government's not shifting on things which are basic human rights. And civil society has taken the South African government to court, both on a healthcare issue and on a textbook issue, and has won and forced government to. So using the judiciary. So for example, in South Africa, the judiciary is very independent and good. But for example, we were talking about the same example in Zim, where that's not possible. So. using whatever means work.
Very interesting. So actually, we started with Narciso was talking about how important it was actually to build the capacity of public and elected officials, because they very often end up in offices, in functions which they are really not prepared to perform. So they don't know how to do a budget, they don't know how to execute on a policy. So it's difficult to talk about good governance when you don't have that basic capacity, especially in rural areas. Narciso was talking about working in rural Mozambique. So that was an important point. Second, monitoring of public funds allocation and spending. So basically looking at what the government says in terms of policy priorities and what's actually reflected in where the money goes, and bringing that to light. So we had a lot of conversation also later on about how a lot of this information actually is just buried somewhere and people don't really have access to it, and bringing out to the light can help a lot to improve governance. And it goes back to the conversation with Mo also earlier today about when the data is available, when there's analysis done, when you have the facts on the table, it's much easier to have a conversation. We did have a conversation around the fact that the change has to start with us. So there was some conversation around governance within the civil society and how do we model the behavior to show to the other sectors that we committed to the transparency, accountability, and governance. There was a little bit of in terms of the interventions. There was a little bit of talk about sort of this blackmail approach, or basically threatening to pull out of projects with the government. Basically, where you are in a position to do that, where you are able to say, okay, we're not going to work with you if you don't improve on certain matters, then it can be an effective strategy actually, because the officials themselves get nervous about losing that kind of relationship. There was a talk about sort of more generally about advocacy and lobbying in the government as strategies to improve governance. Again, documenting and evidence. I think that's a recurring theme. There was Tomaida was describing to us a case of actually exposing the government to the problem. So basically a situation where the public officials are actually not themselves aware of how bad the situation is. They don't really know the situation on the ground. And so once they get to it, it's an eye-opener. A lot of actually similarity with some of the methodologies that Synergos uses in our learning journeys, in bringing people in the system to reconnect with what they're working on. The bureaucrats reconnecting back to the ground work. Let's see, what was the next one? I think the next one was that one. Creating spaces for people in the system to be empowered. How often people who work in the government or within the structures feel like they don't have the power to do anything. So it sounds a bit of like a paradox, by empowering the government actually to do it, empowering the technical people, the people at the administrative level, to actually be able to participate and do the work. A tactic of actually using public embarrassment, using the evidence and the documents to shame the government into doing things. Creating spaces that give voice to the community, which is also lacking. A really fascinating case that Mary was putting forward of actually translating translating the laws into the practice, helping not just people in a larger society understand, but even the lawmakers themselves understand what the laws actually mean that they're implementing, that they're passing. So because we're talking about documents that are thousands of pages sometimes, and actually somebody translating into, okay, this is what it means in practice, this is what a system should be doing, is something that seems to be a missing link, and one that can really improve governance, because people basically don't know what's in those documents, and somebody doing the legwork, like Mary's organization, and giving people a ready product that they can use is highly effective in that sense, and at the same time giving them the credit for doing it. So that's a very tricky situation, but something that Mary is definitely doing well. Again, and along the lines of, once you have the translated information, once you have the practical information, monitoring the budgets, informing the public about how that's being implemented, auditing the local governments, also in terms of the capacity. So basically, you have laws passed which predict that which assume that the government is going to do A, B, and C, when the government cannot even do A, right? And so whether the government has the capacity to deliver on what's prescribed in the law and bringing that to light. Educating community, again, that's a recurring theme. Role of media and publicity, really exposing these things. Very interesting conversation with Neville around having the infrastructure and the space for interaction between the state and the non-state actors. The fact that our systems very often assume that there's a space where the elected officials will interact with the civil society or will interact with the citizens, when in fact that's not really prescribed by the law, or it happens only by lobbying groups or narrow interest group. It doesn't really happen with wider citizenry. So a very, very interesting comment there are how you create this kind of spaces, networks around specific issues, but focused spaces that allow for this exchange and also for continuity over time, because one of the challenges of governance is the huge attrition or turnover in the government. So how do you also have spaces which allow for continuity of policies or continuity of discussions and learning and implementation of certain longer term visions, and building relationship across the sectors. Here we have the longer term vision that I just mentioned. A very basic thing, it would seem actually, that Neville also brought up, is that really to have good governance you need strong civil service. You need professional public administrators, people who know the business and not just politically brought into their jobs. I'm funny.
I can't seem to be governing myself. Leadership crisis here.
A leadership crisis. Sorry, I'm just about to be done. Neville made a comment that for everyone just to step out of their daily tasks and routine and thinking about the bigger picture helps with governance overall, because you get a different perspective on it. Strong comments around the fact that the focus of civil society should be to make the state work, not to necessarily create parallel systems or alternatives, but to make the state work. And then a conversation with Teboho around how you balance process and outcomes in governance, and a very interesting statement that governance by compliance is not enough. or it's just not sufficient. There has to be much more of the will and interest of parties to get involved.